So, we're reading Chapter 8 in Primitive Mythology in London. Primitive Mythology is a book written by Joseph Campbell. And we're reading Part 4 of Chapter 8. I wondered sometimes, states Mr. Bridges, who was himself an initiated member of the Hain, whether these strange appearances might be the remains of a dying religion, but came to the conclusion that this could not be so. There was no vestige of any legend to suggest that any of these creatures impersonated by the Indians had ever walked the earth in any form but fantasy. Among the Yagans, or Yamana, too, the southern neighbors of the Ona, but a very different folk, much shorter in stature and devoted not to hunting guanaco in the hills, but to fishing and sealing along the dangerous shores. There was the legend that formerly their women had ruled by witchcraft and cunning. According to their stories, states Mr. Bridges, it was not so very long ago that the men assumed control. This was apparently done by mutual consent. There is no indication of a wholesale massacre of the women, such as took place, judging from that tribe's mythology, among the Ona. There is, not far from Ushuaia, every sign of a once vast village where, it is said, a great gathering of natives took place. Such a concourse was never seen before or since, canoes arriving from the farthest frontiers of the Yagan land. It was at that momentous conference that the Yagan men took authority into their own hands, and Mr. Bridges concludes, this legend of leadership being wrested from the women, either by force or coercion, is too widely spread throughout the world to be lightly ignored. Among the Australians, as Spencer and Gillen have noted, in past times the position of women in regard to their association with sacred objects and ceremonies was very different from that which they occupy at the present day. At Emily Gap, one of the most important sacred spots of the Aranda, for example, there is a drawing on the rocks that is supposed to have sprung up spontaneously to mark the place where the Altjaringa women of the mythological age adorned themselves with ceremonial paint and stood peering up, watching, while the men performed their ceremonies of animal increase. In Tikyuma, from which the women today are absolutely excluded. One of the drawings is supposed to represent a woman leaning on her elbow against the rocks and gazing upwards. Other observers also have noted evidences in Australia of an age when the role of women in the mythological lore and ceremonial life was more prominent than that accorded them today. Father E.F. Worms of Broome, for example, has described a cluster of archaic petroglyphs in the northwestern desert at a site in the upper Yule River area known as Mangulagura, Woman Island, where all the engravings are representations of women. From their prominent vulvas 3 lines proceed, which may represent magical emanations of some kind, and above them is a curving picture of the rainbow snake. One is tempted to surmise that there may have taken place in the human past either some crisis of which these legends would be widely distributed report, or a number of such crises in various parts of the world. And according to the view of the culture historical school represented by the monumental 12-volume work of Father W. Schmidt on the origin of the idea of God, there is actually evidence enough to justify a historical hypothesis of this kind. Father Schmidt and his colleagues have found it necessary to distinguish 3 basic types or stages of primitive society. The first is that of the simplest peoples known to the science of ethnology, the little Yugans, or Yamana, of the southernmost channels and coves of the rugged of rugged Tierra del Fuego, a number of extremely primitive scattered tribes of Patagonia and Central California, the Caribou Eskimo of northern Canada, the Pygmies of the Congo and of the Andaman Islands, and the Kurnai of southern Australia. The ethnological circumstances of these humble hunting, fishing, and collecting peoples do not give rise to either a strong patriarchal or a strong matriarchal emphasis. Rather, an essential equality prevails between the sexes, each performing its appropriate tasks without arrogating to itself any special privileges or peculiar rights to command. The ceremonies of initiation at puberty are not confined to the boys and men, nor separated into male and female rites, but are nearly identical for the two sexes. Nor do the rites involve any physical deformation or communication of mystical secrets. They are simply concentrated courses of education for adolescents to the end of making good fathers and mothers of the initiates. Special tribal or group interests do not stand in the foreground of the teaching, since the tribal feeling in such groups is not greatly developed. The typical social unit being merely a cluster of 20 to 40 parents and children, whose main social problem is hardly more than that of living harmoniously together, gathering food enough to eat during the day, and inventing pleasant games to play together after dark. The second stage or type of primitive society recognized by this culture historical school of ethnology is that of the large, totemistic hunting groups, with their elaborately developed clan systems, age classes, and tribal traditions of ritual and myth. Examples of such peoples are abundant on the plains of North America and the pampas of South America, as well as in the deserts of Australia. Their rites of initiation, as we have seen, are secret. Women are excluded, physical mutilations and ordeals are carried sometimes to an almost incredible extreme, and they culminate generally in circumcision. Moreover, there is considerable emphasis placed on the role and authority of the men, both in the religious and in the political organization of the symbolically articulated community. Not infrequently, the circumcision of the boys is matched by comparable operations on the girls: artificial or ceremonial defloration, enlargement of the vagina, removal of the labia minora, partial or complete clitorectomy, etc. But in such cases, the two systems of ceremonial, the male and the female, are kept separate, and the women do not gain through their rites any social advantage over the men. On the contrary, there is a distinct one-sidedness in favor of the male in these highly organized hunting societies, the influence of the women being confined, when it exists at all, to the domestic sphere. According to the hypothesis of Father Schmidt and his colleagues, the puberty initiations of this second stage or type of primitive society have stemmed from those of the first, with, however, a bias in favor of the males, and therewith an emphasis on the sexual aspect of the rites, and particularly on circumcision. A very different course of development is to be traced, however, in the sphere of the tropical gardening cultures, where a third type or stage of social organization matured that was almost completely antithetical to that of the hunting peoples. For in these areas it was the women, not the men, who enjoyed the magical, religious, and social advantage, they having been the ones to effect the transition from plant collecting to plant cultivation. In the simple societies of the first sort, the males in general are the hunters, and the women are the collectors of roots, berries, grubs of various kinds, frogs, lizards, bugs, and other delicacies. Societies of the second type evolved in areas where an abundance of large game occasioned a Herculean development of the dangerous art of the hunt, while those of type 3 took form where the chief sources of nutriment were the plants. Here it was the women who showed themselves supreme. They were not only the bearers of children, but also the chief producers of food, by realizing that it was possible to cultivate as well as to gather vegetables. They had made the earth valuable, and they became consequently its possessors. Thus they won both economic and social power and prestige, and the complex of the matriarchy took form. The men in societies of this third type were within one jot of being completely superfluous, and if, as some authorities claim, they can have no knowledge of the relationship of the sexual act to pregnancy and birth, we may well imagine the utter abyss of their inferiority complex. Small wonder, furthermore, if, in reaction to their revengeful imaginations, ran amok and developed secret lodges and societies, the mysteries and terrors of which were directed primarily against the women. According to the view of Father Schmidt, the ceremonials of these secret lodges are to be distinguished radically from those of the hunting tribe initiations, their psychological function being different and their history different too. Admission to them is through election and is generally limited. They are not for all. Moreover, they tend to be propagandistic, reaching beyond the local tribe, seeking friends and members among alien peoples, and thus bringing it about that, for example, in both West Africa and Melanesia, the chapters of certain lodges are to be found dispersed among greatly differing tribes. As already noted, a particular stress is given in these secret men's societies to a skull cult that is often associated with the headhunt. Ritual cannibalism and pederasty are commonly practiced, and there is a highly elaborated use made of symbolic drums and masks. Ironically, yet by no means illogically, the most prominent divinities of these lodges are frequently female, even the Supreme Being itself being imagined as a great mother. And in the mythology and ritual lore of this goddess, a lunar imagery is developed, as we have also already seen. In considering such extreme initiation rites among hunters as those of the Central Australians, which we reviewed briefly in Part 1, Father Schmidt calls attention to the secondary influences that can readily be shown to have entered the hunting areas of Australia from the gardening cultures of Melanesia and New Guinea. Comparably, when dealing with Mr. Lucas Bridges' friends, the Yagans and Ona of Tierra del Fuego, he explains the Hain, with its anti-feminine antics, as an alien institution ultimately derived through Patagonia from the planting cultures of the South American tropical zone. Whereas the aim of their puberty initiations, he writes in his discussion of the primitive hunting tribes of Tierra del Fuego, was that of turning boys and girls into competent human beings, parents and tribal members, their teachings and examples being based on the firm foundation of a supreme being, both powerful and good, reposing in eternity. The men's festivals not only were addressed to an ignoble, immoral aim, but strove for it through ignoble and immoral means. The aim was to undo the harmonious state of equal privilege and mutual reliance of the two sexes that originally had prevailed in their simple society, supported by economic circumstance, and to establish, through intimidation and the subjection of the women, a cruel ascendancy of the males. The means were Halloween burlesques in which the players themselves did not believe, and which, consequently, were lies and impostures from beginning to end. And the ill effects that issued from all this were not only disturbances of the social balance of the sexes, but also a coarsening and self-centering of the males, who were striving for such ends by such means. The exoneration of their action, which the men felt called upon to advance in their myth, namely that it was the women who had done these things first, and that consequently the performances of the men's lodge were justified, was actually an indefensible plea, for there had never been any such practice of agriculture in their community as could have given rise to the matriarchal supremacy reported in the myth. The whole story must have been imported from some other region, where a matriarchy based on horticulture had incited a reaction of the males and their development of men's societies, which then, together with their system of men's festivals, were carried to Tierra del Fuego. Stop there for now. Thanks for joining me.